The morning had started like any other, with the hum of activity at the bustling airport blending seamlessly with the chatter of travelers and the distant roar of airplanes taxiing down runways. Families, tourists, and business travelers all moved with purpose, some clutching boarding passes with a mix of excitement and fatigue, others glancing nervously at the departure boards as if the flight times were suggestions rather than mandates. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the faint tang of jet fuel, creating that unique, inescapable airport aroma that somehow meant both adventure and inevitability. Among the passengers waiting to board Flight 482, there was a sense of ordinary routine, luggage being checked, tickets scanned, last-minute phone calls, and the occasional cry of a toddler that pierced the otherwise ambient noise. People settled into their seats with the habitual sighs of those who had flown many times before, a mixture of comfort and familiarity and slight dread that always accompanies air travel. On board, the cabin was warm, filled with the soft hum of engines that had only moments ago been ignited with meticulous precision. The passengers chatted softly, some immersed in the in-flight magazine, others fiddling with screens on their devices, watching movies or scrolling through news feeds. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisles, smiling politely and ensuring every seatbelt was fastened, trays were stowed, and safety instructions were properly understood. It was a scene that could have belonged to any flight on any ordinary day, yet there was an undercurrent of anticipation, the invisible tension that always exists when hundreds of lives are confined within a metal tube thousands of feet above the earth. In the middle of this ordinary setting sat an 18-year-old, not unlike the others in his age group, bright-eyed, slightly anxious, but mostly caught up in his own thoughts. He had flown before, of course, but never with the weight of responsibility that today would thrust upon him. He watched the clouds drift lazily past the window, the sun casting golden streaks through the aircraft, and he marveled at the beauty of the world from above. For most, this would have been a serene and uneventful flight. For him, the serenity was about to shatter in ways no one could have imagined. Suddenly, the calm was interrupted. There was a faint, almost imperceptible shudder of the aircraft that made some passengers glance around in curiosity. It was quickly dismissed by most as turbulence, the routine kind that every seasoned flyer knows will pass without incident. Yet, beneath the surface of normalcy, something catastrophic was unfolding. The young man noticed it first in the subtle tension of the cabin crew, the slight furrow in a flight attendant's brow, the rigid posture of a man who was supposed to appear calm. Then came the unmistakable chaos, the sharp, jarring movements of the plane, the high-pitched alarm from the cockpit, and the sudden, panicked screams of passengers as they realized the flight was no longer steady. Drinks spilled, tray tables toppled, and people clutched their loved ones in desperate attempts at reassurance, though no one truly knew what they were holding on to. The young man's eyes darted to the cockpit, where something utterly unimaginable was happening. Both the pilot and co-pilot, the figures trained to handle every conceivable emergency, slumped forward, unconscious. The sight was surreal, like a scene ripped from a nightmare or a disaster movie, except this was frighteningly real. Panic rippled through the cabin as the plane tilted dangerously, the engines whining under stress, and the overhead bins rattled ominously. The gentle hum that had comforted passengers moments ago had transformed into a throbbing, mechanical roar that seemed to mock the helplessness of those inside. Every instinct screamed at him to panic, to scream, to hide, but he couldn't. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside, a spark of clarity ignited, a realization that survival depended not on fear, but on action. He scanned the cabin in a rapid, almost desperate sweep, parents clutching their children, elderly passengers frozen in shock, travelers wide-eyed with disbelief. He saw the rising tide of fear in every face, and it became painfully clear that if no one did anything, chaos would turn into catastrophe. He took a deep breath, forcing his heart to slow despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His mind raced, and though he had no formal training, no prior experience in aviation beyond occasional observation and fascination with planes, one thought crystallized with undeniable clarity: someone had to take control. That someone was him. Every movement became purposeful now. He stood up, legs shaking from the combination of fear and determination, and made his way toward the cockpit. The passengers looked on, some screaming, some frozen, as the young man approached the door that symbolized both hope and the unimaginable challenge ahead. He had to open it. He had to step into the unknown. His hands, clammy and trembling, fumbled with the latch, but determination fueled his precision. The cockpit door yielded, and he found himself face to face with the controls that had once seemed abstract, now terrifyingly real. The sight of the slumped pilots, inert and unresponsive, sent a fresh wave of panic through him, but he forced himself to focus. There was no time to dwell on fear, the lives of everyone on board depended on his actions. His first instinct was to reach for the communication device, the radio that could connect him to the ground, to someone who knew what to do. His voice cracked as he spoke, calling out for guidance, but the words themselves were a lifeline, tethering him to hope. In that moment, he realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. Instructions came through from air traffic control, voices calm and authoritative, guiding him step by step. The complexity of the cockpit, with its myriad switches, gauges, and indicators, threatened to overwhelm him, yet he clung to the instructions like a life raft, following each word with painstaking precision. Every adjustment, every minor correction to altitude and heading, felt monumental. The plane lurched and groaned under the stress, yet he persisted, driven by the singular goal of keeping the aircraft stable and the passengers safe. As he gripped the yoke, he felt the immense responsibility pressing down on him, the gravity of the moment stretching time into a slow-motion nightmare. He thought of the people he had seen moments earlier, children laughing, couples holding hands, elderly travelers dozing, realizing that in a matter of minutes, their lives could hinge entirely on his actions. Every decision, no matter how small, carried profound consequences. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Panic whispered in the recesses of his mind, but he silenced it with every ounce of focus he could muster. The cabin, meanwhile, was a cacophony of fear and uncertainty. Passengers clung to their seats, praying, sobbing, and attempting to comfort one another, yet a palpable sense of awe began to spread. Slowly, the whispers of fear were tempered by the recognition of something extraordinary happening before their eyes. A young man, barely an adult, had stepped into the cockpit, assuming responsibility that none could have imagined. In that moment, he was more than a passenger, he had become the beacon of hope, the single thread holding together hundreds of lives suspended in peril. Time seemed to stretch as the plane continued its precarious journey through the sky. Every cloud outside the window, every flicker of turbulence, became a test of his resolve. He repeated the instructions to himself, the mechanical terms echoing in his mind as he manipulated the controls with increasing confidence. The initial terror began to transform into a focused determination, a clarity of purpose that allowed him to override the instinct to panic. He was acutely aware that the fate of everyone aboard rested on his shoulders, and the enormity of that realization drove him to rise above fear, to push beyond the limitations of experience, and to embrace a courage that he had never known he possessed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each one a battle against chaos, but also a testament to human resilience and the capacity to rise in the face of unimaginable adversity. Passengers whispered among themselves, some murmuring prayers, others marveling at the composure of the young hero now visible through the cockpit door. He was not just fighting to control the plane, he was fighting to preserve life, to defy the odds, and to demonstrate that even in the direst circumstances, determination and bravery could shine through the darkness. The young man's mind worked furiously, processing each gauge, each instrument, each subtle shift in the aircraft's balance. He made minute adjustments, correcting course and stabilizing altitude, each movement a careful dance between precision and instinct. His hands became steady, guided not only by the instructions from the ground but also by an inner resolve that refused to let fear dominate. He visualized each action, imagined the plane's response, and recalibrated continuously, learning, adapting, and improvising in real time. Though inexperienced, his intuition, courage, and sheer determination compensated for the lack of formal training, creating a miracle of human capability unfolding at 30,000 feet. As the plane continued to glide through the sky, the young man became increasingly aware of the lives depending on him, the fragile balance between catastrophe and survival. Every passenger, every soul aboard, was a silent testament to his perseverance. He drew on memories, instincts, and fragments of knowledge absorbed from countless documentaries, books, and videos about aviation. Every fiber of his being was focused on one goal: to ensure that everyone made it home safely. The enormity of the responsibility was staggering, yet he embraced it, transforming fear into a driving force, a relentless determination to overcome what seemed insurmountable. Despite being inexperienced, the teenager approached the cockpit, each step heavier than the last as if the weight of the entire plane rested on his shoulders. His heart thundered violently in his chest, a drumbeat of fear and determination that made each movement feel both urgent and surreal. He was painfully aware that he had no training, no license, no certification to perform the task he was about to undertake, and yet the unconscious pilots left him with no choice. Panic bubbled within him, threatening to break his focus, but he forced it down with trembling resolve. The cockpit door loomed in front of him, a barrier separating him from the unimaginable responsibility of controlling a jet carrying over 300 lives. His fingers brushed against the handle, slick with sweat, and for a moment he froze, taking a deep, shaky breath as he tried to steady his racing thoughts. Once the latch gave way, he stepped inside and was immediately overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the cockpit. Gauges, levers, buttons, and screens surrounded him in a bewildering array, each device essential to the safe operation of the aircraft. The yoke, the throttle, the rudder pedals, all instruments of a world he had only glimpsed through documentaries and online tutorials, now demanded his full attention. The smell of electronics and the faint tang of recycled air filled his senses, intensifying the surreal nature of the situation. He looked down at the pilots, slumped over their controls, and for the first time, the reality of the moment hit him with crushing force. The responsibility was terrifying, but there was no time for hesitation. His hands found the yoke, shaking violently as he gripped it. He had never flown anything beyond a video game simulation, and yet here he was, tasked with guiding a massive aircraft through the sky. The plane shuddered beneath him, rocked by turbulence that sent a shiver down his spine and made him grip the controls even tighter. Each movement was magnified, each adjustment critical. The teenager's mind raced, trying to recall everything he had ever learned or seen about flying. Diagrams from online tutorials, YouTube videos about cockpit operations, emergency procedures, everything collided in his thoughts, forming a patchwork of knowledge that he desperately tried to apply. Outside, clouds raced past the windows in a blur, but inside the cockpit, time felt distorted. Each second stretched into an eternity, punctuated by the groaning of the aircraft and the distant screams of passengers. The teenager's hands trembled as he adjusted the throttle, trying to maintain altitude. He could hear the whine of the engines, the hiss of pressurized air, and the subtle vibrations that told him the plane was in distress. His chest tightened with anxiety, but he forced himself to focus, repeating the instructions from air traffic control like a mantra. The radio crackled to life, breaking through the chaos of alarms and wind. Flight 482, this is ATC. Do you copy? Can you confirm control of the aircraft? The voice was calm but urgent, a lifeline in the storm of fear. The teenager swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he responded, "Yes, I'm in control. I need instructions." The controller's voice remained steady, each word deliberate, guiding him through a procedure that seemed impossibly complicated for someone with no experience. Keep the wings level, maintain your current heading, adjust throttle gradually to stabilize altitude. You're doing fine. I need you to keep your focus on the artificial horizon. Can you see it? He nodded, even though they couldn't see him, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with desperate intensity. The artificial horizon wavered, the plane rocked, and for a terrifying moment, he feared he had misjudged everything. But he listened carefully, taking deep breaths and adjusting the yoke with trembling precision. The controller's voice was a tether, keeping him connected to a world that understood the mechanics of flight while his own instincts struggled to interpret the gauges and indicators in front of him. Each correction brought a temporary sense of relief, followed by renewed tension. Turbulence struck with sudden force, shaking the plane violently and sending loose items tumbling through the cabin. He felt the aircraft tilt, a terrifying sensation that made his stomach lurch. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his shirt, but he refused to release the controls. He adjusted the rudder pedals with awkward movements, trying to counteract the rolling motion, his mind calculating angles, speeds, and altitudes in real time. Every small success was hard-won, and each failure brought a rush of panic he had to suppress. Memories of earlier flights surfaced, flickers of familiarity from the times he had looked through the cockpit window, watched pilots at work, imagined himself in control. Now, those imagined scenarios collided with reality, and he realized that there was no room for error. The lives of 313 people, families, children, and elderly travelers, all depended on his actions. His fear transformed into determination, his hesitation into focus. He began to anticipate the plane's responses, predicting how it would tilt or sway, learning with astonishing speed under the pressure of life or death stakes. Through it all, air traffic control remained his guide. Maintain a slight nose-up attitude. Increase thrust slowly. You're approaching critical altitude limits. Keep calm and steady. The teenager followed every instruction, repeating the terms mentally to cement them in his consciousness. He adjusted the throttle, manipulated the yoke, and monitored the vertical speed indicator, each action a careful negotiation between instinct and instruction. The cockpit felt like a battlefield, the plane both adversary and fragile ally in the struggle to maintain control. Below, the cabin was a storm of fear and anxiety. Passengers clung to their seats, prayed, or tried to comfort one another. Some stared at the ceiling, eyes wide, as if the very roof of the aircraft could somehow protect them. Others whispered prayers, their voices trembling with desperation, while children cried and parents tried to shield them from the reality of the crisis. Every now and then, a passenger would glance toward the cockpit, catching a glimpse of the young teenager gripping the controls with white-knuckled determination. Slowly, a sense of awe began to replace panic in some hearts. They recognized, even in their terror, the courage of the young man who had stepped into a role no one expected him to fill. Turbulence intensified, clouds whipping past the windows as if the storm itself were testing the teenager's resolve. Lightning flashed in the distance, momentarily illuminating the interior with stark brightness. He could hear the groan of the plane's fuselage, feel the vibration of engines under strain, and smell the faint electrical tang of the cockpit instruments. Each sensation reminded him of the fragility of their situation and strengthened his determination. He would not fail. He could not fail. The thought of the lives depending on him surged through his veins like a current, focusing his mind with a clarity he had never known. The teenager's thoughts occasionally drifted to family, friends, and his own mortality. He imagined the headlines, the impossible story, the disbelief that would follow if he succeeded. But there was no time to dwell on hypotheticals. He repeated instructions, checked instruments, and adjusted the plane's heading with careful precision. He spoke to air traffic control continuously, asking questions when unsure, confirming actions, and following commands with methodical diligence. Each small success, stabilizing the wings, correcting a descent, leveling the altitude, brought a glimmer of hope amidst the terror. Hours seemed to compress into minutes. The teenager's perception of time became warped, each movement monumental, each breath a calculated act of survival. He developed a rhythm, a connection with the aircraft, sensing its responses through subtle vibrations, auditory cues, and visual indicators. The plane, once a terrifying instrument of potential disaster, became an extension of his own determination, a tool through which courage and focus could manifest. The crisis demanded every ounce of his mental and physical energy. He felt exhaustion pressing down, limbs trembling, muscles aching, but he refused to let fatigue dominate. He alternated between monitoring instruments, adjusting controls, and communicating with air traffic control, balancing the technical demands of flight with the emotional weight of responsibility. Occasionally, he glanced toward the unconscious pilots, reminders of the human vulnerability that had set this crisis in motion. His own vulnerability was palpable, yet he had found a strength he never knew existed, the resilience that emerges only in moments of unimaginable pressure. Passengers continued to watch, some whispering prayers, others gripping armrests with white-knuckled intensity. They were aware that their survival depended on a teenager who had been thrust into circumstances beyond imagination. Slowly, the tension began to shift. While fear remained, a sense of hope emerged, fragile but undeniable. The young man's focus, determination, and courage became a beacon, a quiet assurance that despite the chaos, someone was in control. The plane continued its treacherous journey through turbulence, with clouds darkening the sky outside and wind gusts testing the limits of both man and machine. The teenager adapted constantly, learning the nuances of the aircraft through real-time experience. He adjusted flaps, monitored speed, and maintained communication with air traffic control, each decision guided by a combination of instinct, instruction, and sheer willpower. His understanding of the aircraft grew with every passing moment, a testament to the extraordinary capacity of the human mind when faced with life or death stakes. Minutes dragged like hours as the teenager battled both the physical and psychological demands of the situation. His hands, once shaky, began to move with increasing confidence, each adjustment measured, deliberate, and precise. He felt the plane respond, the subtle corrections stabilizing its flight path, and for the first time, a glimmer of control emerged amidst the chaos. It was a fragile control, precarious and tenuous, yet it represented the difference between disaster and survival. The young hero gripped the yoke tightly, his knuckles white against the polished control, sweat streaming down his forehead as the jet continued its perilous descent. Each breath came in measured bursts, his lungs burning with exertion, but his focus never wavered. The aircraft, a massive metal behemoth, responded to his every input with a sensitivity that seemed almost sentient. He had no formal training, no certification, yet in these critical moments, instinct, determination, and sheer will guided his hands, directing the plane toward the nearest airport with a precision that felt almost miraculous. Outside the windows, clouds swirled and wind buffeted the fuselage, making the young pilot acutely aware of every jolt and shift, every subtle change in air pressure and engine sound. Inside the cabin, passengers alternated between terror and awe. Some clutched their seats, white-knuckled, praying silently or sobbing quietly, unable to process the miracle unfolding in front of them. Others pressed their faces to the windows, watching the clouds streak past in blurred lines as the plane maintained an almost impossibly stable trajectory. A low hum of fear mixed with awe filled the cabin, punctuated by the occasional cry of a child or the whispered reassurance of a parent. For all of them, the sight of a teenager calmly manipulating the controls of a jetliner, with no formal instruction, was both terrifying and inspiring. They could see the sweat glistening on his brow, the tension in his posture, and yet, somehow, the plane remained steady, obedient to his guidance. He adjusted the throttle slightly, monitoring the airspeed indicator and vertical speed, making minute changes to maintain a steady glide. The control surfaces responded to his touch, banking gently as he aligned the aircraft with the approach path that air traffic control had instructed. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations and recall: distance to the airport, altitude, descent rate, wind speed, flap settings, landing gear deployment. Every piece of information mattered, every second counted. He found himself speaking aloud, repeating instructions in mental notes, as if voicing them would solidify their importance in his mind. Flaps 30, landing gear, maintain 200 knots, slight nose up. The controller's voice crackled through the radio, calm and deliberate, a lifeline in the maelstrom of stress. Flight 482, you're approaching the final approach. Maintain heading 270, descend gradually. You're doing well, keep calm and steady. Gear down at 20 miles from touchdown. The teenager nodded, though he knew they could not see him, his hand reaching for the landing gear lever, feeling the click as it engaged, a sound that resonated through the cockpit and reverberated in his chest. The plane responded with a slight dip, the nose adjusting as the wheels deployed, but his focus never faltered. The wind howled outside, buffeting the fuselage with violent gusts, sending tremors through the aircraft. He felt each shudder as if it were a personal challenge, testing his resolve and threatening to throw the plane off course. The young pilot's eyes flicked between the instruments and the horizon, reading the artificial horizon with precision, noting subtle deviations and correcting them instantly. He visualized the runway, the approach path, the alignment with the centerline, and with each small adjustment, he guided the plane closer to safety. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity as he fought to control the massive machine with nothing but his focus and determination. Inside the cabin, passengers murmured prayers, whispered words of encouragement to one another, and some could only stare, paralyzed by fear and amazement. A mother held her child tightly, murmuring, "He's going to get us down. He has to." Across the aisle, an elderly man shook his head in disbelief, tears streaming down his face. A teenager, he whispered. It was impossible, and yet the evidence was undeniable. Every shift of the plane, every correction, every level glide reassured them that survival was still possible. They could feel the miracle in the air, tangible and surreal, and it was anchored in the courage of the young man at the controls. He adjusted the flaps again, lowering them incrementally to stabilize the descent and increase lift as the runway grew larger in the forward windshield. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his shirt, running down his neck, yet he did not pause. Each input was deliberate, calculated, and executed with precision born from sheer necessity. He monitored the airspeed, adjusting the throttle carefully to maintain the delicate balance between too fast and too slow, too high and too low. The engines hummed under strain, but they obeyed his commands, a testament to the responsiveness of modern aircraft systems and the instinctive coordination of a mind under extreme pressure. Moments of terror punctuated the descent. A sudden gust of wind from the right caused the plane to bank unexpectedly, sending a shudder through the cabin. The teenager's heart leapt, but he corrected instantly, counteracting the tilt with a swift but careful movement of the yoke. Each correction was a delicate dance between reaction and anticipation, between instinct and instruction. Air traffic control's voice remained calm in his ear, guiding, reassuring, but he could feel the tension, the stakes, and the lives depending entirely on his actions. He remembered watching planes land from the airport observation deck as a child, imagining the pilots inside, dreaming of flight. Never in his wildest imagination had he envisioned himself in such a position, yet here he was, embodying every lesson, every observation, every fragment of knowledge absorbed over years of fascination. He could feel a rhythm emerging, a synergy between himself and the aircraft, as if the plane were an extension of his own body, responding to thoughts as much as hands. It was an unnatural harmony, forged in extremity, and yet it worked, keeping the massive jet level, steady, and on course. The runway approached rapidly, a strip of concrete that seemed impossibly small from 30,000 feet above. The lights stretched forward, blinking in a pattern that seemed almost accusatory, reminding him of the precision required to land safely. His palms were raw from gripping the yoke, muscles trembling from sustained tension, but his focus sharpened to an almost obsessive point. Every instruction from air traffic control was absorbed instantly, each adjustment measured, the plane responding to his touch as if it understood the importance of the moment. Passengers had begun to notice subtle changes, the plane's rocking lessened, the descent smoothed, and the initial panic slowly transformed into a tense, hopeful anticipation. Conversations had ceased. The cabin was filled with a collective breath held in silent prayer. A young girl whispered to her father, "He's really doing it. He's getting us down." Tears streaked faces across the cabin, a mix of fear, relief, and awe, as the young hero guided the plane closer to safety with calm precision. The turbulence remained, relentless and unforgiving, each gust threatening to undo his meticulous corrections. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cockpit instruments and the young pilot's determined face. He felt the plane sway slightly, and instinctively countered, banking just enough to keep it level. Each second was monumental, a battle between chaos and control, and he fought with every ounce of focus he could summon. Sweat burned his eyes, yet he refused to blink away the concentration, eyes locked on the instruments, hands moving with deliberate accuracy. Air traffic control's voice was steady, a lifeline of reassurance and guidance. "You're aligned with the runway. Reduce speed gradually. Flaps fully deployed. Gear down. You're doing excellent. Stay calm." He repeated the instructions, internalized each word, and executed them with precision, bringing the aircraft into a perfect glide path. The runway grew closer, and with it, the tangible possibility of survival. Each second, each movement, each controlled adjustment was a testament to human courage under unimaginable pressure. The young hero adjusted the throttle one final time, reducing speed to the ideal landing range while keeping the wings level, feet poised over the rudder pedals for any final correction. The passengers could see the runway now, stretching ahead like a beacon of hope. The plane descended with steady grace, each moment a victory over fear, chaos, and uncertainty. His focus remained absolute, the culmination of years of fascination, innate courage, and sheer determination guiding him through a moment that would be remembered for generations. Every passenger felt it, the collective awareness that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The teenager at the controls, despite his inexperience, had achieved what trained pilots might struggle to accomplish under such circumstances. Sweat poured down his face, muscles burned, heart pounded, yet he remained calm, composed, and in control. It was a miraculous display of bravery, precision, and human resilience, a moment where fear was transformed into heroism. The runway stretched out in front of him, illuminated by the steady line of lights that guided the massive aircraft toward its final destination. Each step of the descent had been carefully controlled, every subtle adjustment to the yoke, throttle, and rudder bringing the plane ever closer to safety. Yet in these final moments, the tension inside the cockpit was almost unbearable. The teenager's heart pounded in his chest, a relentless drumbeat that reminded him of the stakes. He was exhausted, every muscle in his body trembling from sustained effort, sweat streaming down his face, soaking his clothes and blurring his vision, yet he refused to let fear take hold. The lives of 313 people were in his hands, and failure was not an option. As the plane approached the runway, the teenager focused on lining up the centerline perfectly. Every instrument, every gauge, every tiny flicker of the runway lights became a guidepost in his mind. He adjusted the flaps to the final position, watching the airspeed indicator carefully to ensure the aircraft neither stalled nor touched down too fast. He felt the weight of the plane shift as he applied gentle back pressure on the yoke, keeping the nose slightly elevated for a smooth landing. The engines roared, their vibrations transmitted through the fuselage, a tangible reminder of the power he had to control. The control tower's voice crackled over the radio, calm and precise, "Flight 482, you are perfectly aligned. Maintain your glide, keep steady, you're almost there." Breathe. You've got this. The teenager's hands gripped the controls with white-knuckled determination, eyes darting between the runway, the artificial horizon, and the instrument panel. Turbulence still rocked the plane occasionally, and gusts of wind tested his every correction, but he remained unwavering. Every instinct he had developed during the flight, the countless hours of observation, the brief online research about flight maneuvers, and the intense focus during the descent, converged into a precise choreography of skill and courage. He could feel the runway beneath him in an almost physical sense, the vibrations of the landing gear preparing to meet the tarmac, the subtle pressure changes in the cabin confirming the plane's angle of descent. Passengers were acutely aware that the plane's life or death balance now rested entirely on the actions of this 18-year-old. They could see him through the cockpit window, the young man's face streaked with sweat, jaw clenched, eyes wide but focused. Some whispered prayers, others held their loved ones close, and some simply stared in awe, hearts hammering in their chests. "He's really doing it," one mother murmured to her child, who clung to her arm, eyes wide. "He's going to get us down safely," an elderly man whispered, gripping the armrest until his knuckles turned white. Every soul aboard felt the tension and the weight of anticipation, the cabin vibrating with fear, hope, and awe simultaneously. The aircraft's wheels touched the runway with a controlled precision, a gentle thud that reverberated through the fuselage. Relief surged through the teenager, though he could not afford to relax yet. He kept the plane aligned, gradually applying the brakes and reverse thrust, feeling the immense weight of the jet slow under his control. Dust and heat rose from the tires, the screech of rubber against asphalt piercing the tense air. He monitored every instrument, every fluctuation, keeping the plane straight and level as it decelerated toward a complete stop. His body was spent, muscles trembling, sweat pouring down, and yet he maintained focus, knowing that even a minor lapse now could undo everything he had achieved. As the plane slowed to a safe taxiing speed, a wave of audible relief swept through the cabin. Passengers erupted in cheers, cries, and laughter, some hugging each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Mothers kissed their children, couples embraced, and strangers shook hands with trembling hands, united by a shared miracle. 313 lives had been saved by the bravery of a single teenager who had refused to succumb to panic. The reality of what had just occurred began to settle in, and the overwhelming gratitude and astonishment filled the air. Every passenger seemed to recognize the heroism, even if they could not yet comprehend its magnitude. The young pilot slowly released his grip on the controls, leaning back slightly as exhaustion overtook him. His chest heaved, lungs burning, and hands shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline that had sustained him for what felt like an eternity now drained away, leaving a heavy, bone-deep fatigue. Yet even in this state, a quiet sense of accomplishment filled him. He had done it. Against all odds, he had guided the plane safely to the ground, keeping hundreds of lives intact. He allowed himself a moment to process the enormity of what had transpired, the realization of the miracle he had just accomplished, even as ground crew rushed forward in anticipation of passengers disembarking and any potential emergencies. Emergency responders were already at the ready, a precautionary measure that had been coordinated with air traffic control. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue personnel lined the taxiways, prepared for any eventuality. As the plane came to a complete stop, the teenager followed instructions to shut down the engines and secure the aircraft. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, calming passengers, confirming that no one was injured, and assisting with the orderly deplaning. The scene was surreal, a juxtaposition of relief, chaos, and awe. Emergency personnel approached, initially treating the situation with urgency, but their expressions shifted to amazement as they realized the story unfolding before them. A single young man had brought a commercial jet safely to the ground under circumstances that defied belief. Media attention was instantaneous. Airport personnel relayed information to news outlets, and within minutes, footage of the young hero at the controls began circulating across social media and television networks. Reporters interviewed passengers, capturing their shock, gratitude, and admiration. "I can't believe it," one woman said through tears. "A teenager, he saved all of us. It's a miracle." The narrative spread like wildfire, each retelling amplifying the courage, composure, and resilience demonstrated by the young man. News anchors and commentators marveled at the story, framing it as a once-in-a-lifetime act of heroism, a real-life testament to courage and presence of mind under unimaginable pressure. The young pilot was escorted from the cockpit by airport security and emergency personnel. He was met with a mixture of awe, congratulations, and concern for his well-being. His body shook from exhaustion, but his mind was flooded with relief and disbelief. He had performed a feat that many experienced pilots might have struggled with even under ideal conditions. The weight of what he had accomplished began to sink in, the understanding that he had saved not just hundreds of lives, but entire families, dreams, and futures. Families reunited on the tarmac, hugging, crying, and expressing gratitude. Passengers pressed into the young hero's presence, attempting to thank him, to convey the depth of their appreciation, though words seemed insufficient. Children clung to him, wide-eyed, seeing him as a superhero. Parents whispered their thanks, their voices quivering with emotion, acknowledging that his bravery had given them a second chance. Every interaction reinforced the reality that the teenager's courage had transformed fear into hope, despair into relief, and potential disaster into an unprecedented miracle. In the hours following the landing, the story continued to unfold across global media. Headlines proclaimed the impossible: teenager lands jet, saves 313 lives, or real-life hero, 18-year-old pilot's plane to safety. News channels broadcast interviews with passengers, air traffic controllers, and aviation experts, analyzing the skill, calm, and bravery displayed. Social media exploded with admiration, sharing photos, videos, and stories about the young hero, generating discussions about courage, resilience, and human potential. For the teenager, the surreal attention was secondary to the realization that every person on that plane had survived because of his actions, a responsibility and achievement that would remain with him forever. As the adrenaline faded, he reflected on the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him to this moment. He remembered the panic in the cabin, the unconscious pilots, the turbulence, and the relentless pressure of guiding the plane safely to the ground. Each memory was vivid, a testament to the intensity of the experience. Yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, he had maintained calm, listened intently to instructions, and relied on his instincts. The enormity of the responsibility had brought forth a level of focus, courage, and resilience that he had never known he possessed. In that moment, he understood what it meant to rise to the occasion, to transform fear into decisive action, and to achieve the extraordinary against all odds. Airlines, aviation authorities, and public figures reached out to acknowledge the feat, expressing admiration for the teenager's courage and composure. The young hero's story became a symbol of hope, inspiring countless individuals around the world. It was a testament to the human spirit, a demonstration that even in moments of overwhelming adversity, determination, courage, and quick thinking could turn potential disaster into survival. In the quiet moments after the chaos subsided, the teenager sat down, finally allowing his body and mind to rest. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac, and the sounds of the airport returned to their ordinary rhythm. He allowed himself to breathe fully for the first time in hours, feeling the immense relief and gratitude of knowing that 313 people were alive because of his actions. Though exhaustion was overwhelming, it was tempered by a profound sense of accomplishment and a deep understanding of the impact of his courage. The world would soon hear the full story, but for him, the immediate reality was the safety of the passengers, the gratitude in their eyes, and the knowledge that he had performed an act of heroism that transcended age, experience, and expectation. He had faced unimaginable fear, risen above it, and transformed potential tragedy into a miracle.